Hi, everybody, and welcome to Love Fraud Live. You know, the sociopath in your life is bad news. This person has hurt, manipulated, and exploited you on purpose. So, why don't you believe it? I'm Donna Andersen, author of lovefraud.com, and tonight I'm going to explain why you can know that you're dealing with a sociopath, but be unable to accept that reality. This presentation is being recorded, so please keep your video and microphone turned off during the presentation. And then when I'm finished, I'll stop the recording and we'll talk. So let's get started. After much confusion, maybe even years of confusion, you finally realize why one of your relationships is so difficult. You're dealing with a sociopath. Whether this person is a romantic partner, a family member, a work colleague, or a friend, he or she engages in some level of abuse. It might be physical, sexual, or financial abuse, but it's certainly emotional and psychological abuse. You know this. You've been disappointed time and time again. So why do you still cling on, hoping that the person will change? Your inability to end the involvement isn't necessarily a failure of willpower. I'm going to explain 3 psychological and biological phenomena that may keep you tied to the sociopath. So the first of these phenomena is cognitive dissonance. Here's the definition of cognitive dissonance on the website called verywellmind.com. They describe it as mental discomfort that results from holding 2 conflicting beliefs, values, or attitudes. The website says that it's the inconsistency between what people believe and how they behave. That's a good general description, but Dr. Leanne Leadham, who has written lots and lots for Love Fraud, explained it with a bit more detail in a recent podcast. She said that once you make a choice, you tend to focus on all the positive aspects of the choice and disregard the negative aspects. So if in the beginning, the person you're involved with seemed great, and then later he or she began mistreating you, you may find yourself remembering the good times and forgetting the bad times. Because you've chosen this relationship, you can't wrap your brain around the reality that it's not as wonderful as you initially thought that it was. You're invested in maintaining a positive view of your partner. Therefore, you may not be able to see the truth of how he or she is actually treating you. This can also apply to other types of relationships. Suppose you start to suspect that your mother or father or your brother is disordered. Well, everybody wants their family members to love them. So it can be really difficult to believe that your mother or father or sibling never loved you and, in fact, is incapable of loving you. It's just too painful, so you don't want to accept it. Consequently, you experience cognitive dissonance. So that's the first phenomenon. Here's the second one. Another reason why you can't accept the reality that the person is a sociopath is that you're flooded with neurotransmitters such as oxytocin and dopamine. Now, perhaps you've read this previously on lovefraud.com. Oxytocin is a hormone and a neurotransmitter that is released naturally in our brains and throughout our bodies when we experience intimacy. Any kind of intimacy will do. Physical touch, conversation, and certainly sex in a romantic relationship. Oxytocin causes us to feel calm and content, and it makes us trust the person with whom we had the experience of intimacy. That's why it's called the cuddle chemical. Then there's another neurotransmitter called dopamine. Dopamine has multiple functions, but for our discussion, the most important one is that it is related to pleasurable reward and motivation. The Cleveland Clinic describes this as dopamine is known as the feel-good hormone. It gives you a sense of pleasure. It also gives you the motivation to do something when you're feeling pleasure. Now, dopamine is also associated with addiction. Perhaps you've heard that before, but it doesn't actually cause the addiction. But what happens is that you can become addicted to an activity that spurs the release of dopamine in your brain. Therefore, when the sociopath is showering you with attention and affection, it causes the dopamine to spike. And that's how you can get addicted to the relationship. So here's the third reason why you can't accept the reality of your involvement with a sociopath. You're trauma bonded. The concept of trauma bonding was introduced by two psychology researchers, and their names are Donald G. Dutton and Susan Painter, and they came up with this theory in 1981, so it's been around a while. They also elaborated on the theory in another paper that was published in 1993. Dutton and Painter identified two features that enable trauma bonds to form: a power imbalance and intermittent good and bad treatment. So, a power imbalance in a relationship means that one person in the relationship has far more social power than the other. So, who's the one with the power? Typically, it's the person who views the relationship as not very important and is willing to walk away. This typically describes a sociopath. Dutton and Painter noted that unequal power relationships can become increasingly unbalanced over time, to the point where the power dynamic itself produces pathology in the individuals involved. So, as this power imbalance magnifies, the subjugated people or person view themselves more negatively and come to believe that they are incapable of fending for themselves and then that they actually need the dominators. Now, this cycle of relationship produced dependency and lowered self esteem is repeated, eventually creating a strong emotional bond from the low power person to the high power person. Typically, the sociopath maintains the power differential through physical, emotional, or psychological abuse. Now, the other factor contributing to the establishment of a trauma bond is the intermittent good and bad treatment. Dutton and Painter researched this in the context of battered women. That's what they typically looked at. So, in many cases, the husband would physically assault the wife and then afterwards be contrite and loving. Now, Dutton and Painter noted that this pattern of aversive and then pleasant conditions matches the learning theory of intermittent reinforcement. And that means that sometimes a behavior is rewarded and sometimes it isn't. So, because you never know when you're going to get your reward, which is the loving and caring partner, you keep trying to do everything you can in order to win their approval. If you remember Psych 101, if you had that, intermittent reinforcement is the most powerful type of conditioning. Dutton and Painter said that the process is highly effective in producing persistent patterns of behavior that are very difficult to extinguish or terminate. In other words, every time you go through this cycle of good and bad treatment, the emotional bond that you feel with your partner gets stronger. And this makes it very difficult for you to leave. So these are the three explanations for why you may have difficulty accepting the reality that you're dealing with a sociopath and that you should end the involvement: cognitive dissonance, oxytocin and dopamine, and the trauma bonding. So what should you do with this information? First of all, please cut yourself some slack. Because of strong psychological and biological pressures, yes, it may indeed be difficult to allow yourself to see the truth and disengage from the person. It's just human nature. So, knowing this, how do you escape? Well, I suggest asking yourself a question and answering it honestly. Here's the question: are you happy now? I'm not asking, were you happy before, or do you hope you'll be happy in the future? Are you happy with this involvement now? So, when you can admit to yourself that you are not happy, the next question is, what are you going to do about it? If you're dealing with a sociopath, the correct answer is to end the involvement and go no contact. Now, this may be difficult for all the reasons that we talked about. So when you do decide to go no contact, you should also plan ways to distract yourself for when you're faltering. Because the longer you can stay away, the more the sociopath's grip on you dissipates and the stronger you'll become. So the secret, as they say in many 12-step programs, because remember, this is an addiction that you're breaking, the secret is to take it one day at a time. Get through today, then get through the next day, and then get through the day after that. If you also, at the same time, work on your emotional healing, which I've talked about in several of the most recent episodes of Love Fraud Live, eventually you'll be free.